Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. They said there wasn't enough room for me on the family trip, as if my place could be erased so easily, but when I picked up the paper that slipped from my daughter-in-law's bag, I saw the truth. 15 seats, 14 names, and the last name wasn't mine. It was her cousin Vanessa, a woman I had only met once now, chosen to sit where I should have been. In that moment, I felt every Sunday dinner, every night of babysitting, every dollar I had given them collapse into nothing. My name is Lorna Hayes, 67 years old, and that was the night I understood. I wasn't forgotten. I was replaced, and they would soon learn what it means to cast me aside. I laid the salmon fillets onto the baking tray, sprinkling them with rosemary and squeezing fresh lemon over the top. The scent filled my small kitchen, comforting and familiar. For years I had made this dish on Sundays, believing it was my grandchildren's favorite. Maybe it wasn't, but I clung to that idea anyway. It gave me purpose, something to hold on to as Sundays grew quieter and colder since my husband passed. The good china was already set on the dining table, the one with faint blue flowers that had dulled after decades of use. I ran my fingers over the edges and straightened each plate. They had been a wedding gift in 1975, and I told myself tonight counted as special enough. I had even bought a lavender blouse from the department store last week, something new to make me feel presentable, dignified. The doorbell rang at exactly 6:30. Daniel had always been punctual like his father. I wiped my hands quickly and opened the door. He leaned in, brushing a light kiss on my cheek, his cologne mixing with the faint trace of cigarettes. He had promised me he quit years ago, but I knew better. Behind him came Marcia, tall in a navy pantsuit, as if she had just left some serious office meeting even though it was Sunday. She handed me a bottle of bargain wine, her smile polite but cold. Ethan shuffled in without looking at me, his phone in hand, hair falling into his eyes. Lily squeezed past, running straight to the living room where the television flickered. "Come in," I said with forced cheer. "Everything is ready." Daniel sat in his usual chair without answering my question about his week. Marcia smoothed her suit jacket and placed the wine on the table, her eyes scanning the room with that calculating look I had grown used to. "Children, I called dinner's ready." Ethan barely lifted his gaze from the glowing screen as he dragged his feet to the table. Lily followed reluctantly, sliding into her chair without a word. I placed a generous portion of salmon onto Ethan's plate, my voice soft with habit. "I made your favorite." "I don't like salmon," he muttered, pushing the plate away. "I never have." My hand froze on the serving spoon. All those Sundays, all those refills I thought meant he loved it. Daniel just shrugged, avoiding my eyes, while Marcia's voice cut through. "Eat what your grandmother made Ethan." She tried her best. I swallowed the lump in my throat and kept my smile steady. "How was work this week, Daniel?" I asked, trying again. He sliced into the salmon without looking up. "It's fine. Nothing special. And you, Marcia? How is the office?" "The usual routine. Nothing that would interest you." Her words stung more than I wanted to admit. I pressed my napkin into my lap, forcing a nod. Lily ate silently. Ethan picked at his food, his phone buzzing against the table. I remembered when Daniel was their age, eager to help me set the table, full of stories about school laughter spilling across this same room. Now it was as though everything I cooked was poison, every question unwelcome. I turned to Lily, my voice gentler. "How was school this week, sweetheart?" She glanced quickly at her mother, then back to her plate. "It was fine." Daniel shifted his fork, clinking against porcelain. The silence stretched until only the clatter of cutlery remained. My palms grew damp. I knew I had to say something to bring up the trip I had overheard them talking about last Sunday. I tried to sound casual. I hear you're planning a trip to Disneyland. That sounds wonderful. When are you going? Daniel and Marcia exchanged a glance, one of those quick, silent conversations only long-married couples could manage. Daniel's jaw tightened. In 2 weeks, he said. We'll be there for 7 days. How exciting, I said, my heart lifting just a little. I've always wanted to go. Your father and I kept planning but never managed. I thought maybe this time. Daniel's eyes finally met mine, full of pity. We're going with a big group. Marcia's parents, her sister and husband, their kids. Marcia cut in, her voice businesslike. We've rented a large van, but space is limited. I blinked, not understanding. Daniel exhaled. There just isn't enough room for you, Mom. I felt the words like ice slipping down my spine. Marcia's knife tapped neatly against her plate. And with your arthritis, it would be difficult anyway. You'd just slow everyone down. I opened my mouth, then closed it again, my mind flashing to the mild knee pain I had mentioned once in passing. I tried to speak, my voice trembling. I could always rest at a cafe when I get tired. I wouldn't want to bother anyone. Daniel's tone turned patronizing, as though I were a child. Let's be realistic. You wouldn't be comfortable. The kids want to run around the park. It just wouldn't work. I looked at Ethan. He kept his eyes on his plate. Lily glanced up, guilt flickering in her small face before quickly looking away. Of course, I managed, my voice distant even to myself. You should spend time together as a family. Marcia let out a breath of relief. I'm glad you understand. Some people would have made a scene. Daniel gave a faint nod. Mom has always been reasonable. Their words twisted inside me, knotting tighter with every beat of silence. I forced myself to smile even as my hands shook under the table. Would anyone like dessert? I asked softly. I made apple pie. Marcia shook her head quickly. We're on a diet, but the kids can have some. Daniel checked his watch. We'll have to leave right after dessert. Busy week ahead. The air in the room grew colder. I cut slices of pie in the kitchen, blinking back tears, remembering the days when Sundays meant board games and movies that stretched into the night. When Daniel used to help me wash dishes, laughing as we splashed water at each other. Now they sat at the table, strangers. I set the pie in front of Lily and Ethan, watching them nibble politely. Ethan barely touched his slice. Marcia explained in her clipped voice. He's on a sports diet. You wouldn't understand. I pressed my lips together. I had understood once. I had cheered for Daniel at every meet, tracked every detail of his nutrition when Hugh insisted on swimming lessons, but those memories meant nothing now. 10 minutes later, they stood by the door, coats in hand. Thanks for dinner, Mom, Daniel said flatly. Yes, thank you, Lorna, Marcia echoed. Bye, Grandma. Lily mumbled, eyes still down. Ethan just nodded, already staring at his phone. Until next Sunday, I asked softly. We might have to skip. Daniel answered, a lot to do before the trip. The door closed behind them, leaving silence heavier than any weight. I stood still, the sound of their car fading, the smell of salmon lingering in the air. My hands trembled as I gathered the empty plates. Something inside me cracked, though I kept moving my body on autopilot. I carried the dishes into the kitchen, rinsing them one by one, my mind replaying Daniel's voice. There isn't enough room. You'd slow everyone down. When I returned to the dining room to wipe the table, I noticed a folded paper on the floor near Marcia's chair. I bent to pick it up, ready to set it aside for next week, until my eyes caught the bold header. Booking confirmation. My breath caught as I scanned the page. 14 names including Daniel, Marcia, Ethan, and Lily. And at the very bottom, a name that did not belong. Vanessa Clark. 15 seats, 14 passengers. One left empty, yet they chose her. My fingers trembled as I held the paper, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might faint. I lowered myself into the chair, staring at the neat black letters. They had not just forgotten me. They had replaced me. The room around me blurred, but that line stayed sharp as glass. I forced a smile, my lips trembling, and tried to steady my hands in my lap. My chest felt tight as if the air in the dining room had turned heavy. Daniel cleared his throat and spoke in the same calm tone he used when explaining something to a stubborn client. "Mom, you have arthritis. All the walking at Disneyland would be too hard. You wouldn't enjoy it." Before I could respond, Marcia leaned forward, her fork tapping lightly against her plate. "Vanessa has so much energy," she said flatly. "The kids love her spirit. It will be easier for everyone." The words sliced through me more sharply than I expected. I glanced at Lily, hoping for some sign of contradiction, some tiny defense. For a moment, her eyes met mine wide with something like guilt before she quickly dropped her gaze back to her plate. Ethan stayed hunched over, picking at his food as though nothing unusual was happening. I swallowed my throat dry and managed to say softly, "Of course, if that's what works best for you." The rest of the meal passed in an unbearable quiet. The clinking of silverware echoed too loudly. I couldn't taste a single bite of my own food. My thoughts spiraled, replaying Marcia's words. Daniel's justification, the silent look from my granddaughter. I wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, but all that came out was a faint murmur about coffee and pie. When I carried the empty plates back to the kitchen, I kept my back straight and my hands steady, but inside my heart thudded painfully. The pie rested untouched on the counter. I sliced into it anyway, arranging pieces on plates, trying to breathe slowly. By the time I returned to the table, Daniel was already glancing at his watch again. The children nibbled without interest. Ethan pushed crumbs around. Lily ate a few bites and looked at her lap. Marcia finished, quickly announcing in her clipped tone that they needed to leave soon. I gathered the dishes again, forcing myself to move quietly, not letting them see the storm inside me. As I bent to collect a napkin near Marcia's chair, something white caught my eye on the floor. A folded sheet of paper tucked under the edge of her handbag. I reached for it instinctively, intending to set it aside to return later. The bold heading stopped me. "Booking confirmation." I froze, the words burning into my eyes. My fingers tightened around the paper as I stood upright, my pulse hammering in my ears. I shouldn't read it, I thought, but something stronger than me forced my gaze lower. 14 names lined neatly on the page, typed in crisp black letters. Daniel Hayes, Marcia Hayes, Ethan Hayes, Lily Hayes, Marcia's parents, her sister, her brother-in-law, their kids. One after another, every seat accounted for. And at the bottom, just above the transportation note, the name Vanessa Clark. I blinked, reread, blinked again. The words would not change. 15 passenger van, 14 travelers confirmed, 1 seat left unclaimed. There had been space. There had been enough room. They simply chose her instead of me. I felt my knees weaken and sank into the nearest chair, the paper trembling in my hands. My eyes stung as the truth pressed down crushing. It wasn't about logistics. It wasn't about arthritis or convenience. It was a choice, a deliberate replacement. I tried to breathe, but the room tilted. The sound of voices blurred as Daniel called to the children to put on their coats. Marcia reminded them about their school bags. Chairs scraped. The front door opened. I couldn't move. "Goodbye, Mom." Daniel called casually from the hall. "We'll see you when we can." "Bye." Grandma Lily's faint voice echoed already halfway out the door. The door clicked shut, leaving me in silence. I sat motionless, the confirmation sheet lying across my lap. The house was still, but my mind was screaming. Every Sunday dinner, every babysitting night, every dollar loaned, every sacrifice suddenly rearranged itself in my memory. Not love, not gratitude, just convenience until someone better, younger, more entertaining could step in. My heart pounded, grief and humiliation twisting together into something darker, something harder. I stared down at Vanessa Clark's name, crisp and undeniable, and a thought crystallized in my chest with terrifying clarity. They hadn't forgotten me. They had replaced me. The clock ticked from the mantel, each second louder than the last. My hands finally lowered the paper to the table. I pressed my palm against the wood to steady myself, staring at the faint scratches Daniel had made as a child when he dragged his toy cars across the surface. A rush of memories collided with the cruel present. My little boy with his gap-toothed smile, the man who now looked at me as a burden. My husband Hugh, gone too soon, who would have never allowed this cold dismissal. The silence of the house pressed in. I rose unsteadily, carried the paper into the kitchen, and placed it on the counter. My reflection in the dark window above the sink looked older, lonelier, and yet sharper than I remembered. Something inside me shifted. My heart was still broken, but in the cracks something new was beginning to stir. I turned off the light and walked slowly down the hall to my bedroom, the sound of my own footsteps echoing back at me. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding the ache in my chest, staring into the shadows. The words replayed again and again until they no longer felt like words but like knives. There was space. There had been space all along, and they chose someone else. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the house utterly silent except for the steady tick of the clock in the hall. Sleep would not come. My mind circled the same words over and over, the paper on the counter still burning in my memory. They had chosen someone else. I turned onto my side, hugging the pillow close, but the ache in my chest only deepened. I thought of Hugh, gone since that morning in 2018 when a heart attack had stolen him in the garden. He had been 66 strong one moment and gone the next. In those first months, Daniel had been there for me, helping with paperwork and funeral arrangements, holding me when I cried. I could still remember the sound of his voice saying, "Mom, you are not alone." Yet tonight, 5 years later, I had never felt more alone in my life. The shadows of the room seemed to grow longer, heavier, until I could not bear to lie still any longer. I rose, my knees stiff, and padded to the living room. I reached up to the shelf where I kept the old photo albums and carried one back to the couch. My hands shook as I opened the cover. The first page held our wedding photo. Hugh in his dark suit, eyes sparkling with that steady kindness, and me in my white dress, a bouquet of roses in my hands. The corners of the picture had yellowed, but the smiles were still alive, frozen in a happiness that now felt like another lifetime. I flipped the page, and there was Daniel, gap-toothed and 6 years old, wearing his Little League uniform. His glove looked too big for his small hands, but his grin was enormous. I could still hear the echo of his voice calling for me in the stands, proud to show me every catch, every swing. I brushed my fingers over the photograph, and tears slid down my cheeks before I could stop them. Another page, and there he was at 10, standing by the Christmas tree, his eyes wide with excitement as Hugh held him steady on his shoulders to put the star on top. That memory rushed back so clearly that for a moment it felt like I could hear Hugh's laugh in the room. I pressed the heel of my hand against my eyes, but the tears kept coming. I turned more pages, finding Daniel at his high school graduation, then at college, then holding newborn Ethan. My chest tightened as I remembered how proud I had been, how ready I was to step in and help. The memories tangled with the present until they blurred together. I thought of all the times Marcia had called me asking for babysitting. "Mom, can you pick up Ethan from school? We both have late meetings. Can you watch Lily this weekend? We have to go out of town." I had said yes every time, never questioning, grateful just to be included in their lives. And then there was the money. At first, just a few hundred here and there until payday, then bigger requests. Tuition deposits, sports camps, new appliances. I had handed over my savings again and again, convincing myself it was temporary, that they would pay me back when things got easier. But the money never returned and the requests never stopped. The truth was sharp now, undeniable. I had not simply been left out of one vacation. I had been reduced to a role a caretaker when needed a wallet, when convenient, a silent presence when no one else wanted to bother. My sobs came in gasps, the photographs blurring through my tears. I closed the album but kept it pressed against my lap, rocking slightly in the quiet. How had it all changed so much? How had my son grown into a man who saw me not as his mother, but as an obligation, an inconvenience, something to be managed and replaced? I wiped my face with the back of my hand and carried the album back to the shelf. My body felt heavy, yet a strange clarity settled in my chest. The pieces of the last 5 years fell into place. Every canceled dinner, every cold response from Marcia, every hurried goodbye. They had been slowly carving me out of their lives long before this trip. The clock chimed midnight. I stood in the center of the living room, the silence pressing in around me, and whispered into the air as if Hugh might still be listening. They have replaced me. Not just on this trip. They replaced me a long time ago. I sank into the rocking chair, Hugh's old seat, the wood creaking beneath my weight. My eyes were swollen, my throat raw, and inside me, the grief twisted into something harder, something that no longer felt like helplessness. The night stretched on as I sat there, the shadows shifting across the floor, the album still heavy in my lap. The realization pulsed through me with every beat of my heart. This was no longer about a van seat or a week at Disneyland. It was about years of being diminished, used, and overlooked. By the time the first gray light seeped through the curtains, my tears had dried. My body was exhausted, but my mind was sharp. The booking paper on the counter was still waiting, a reminder I could not ignore. I rose slowly, my knees aching, and walked back to the kitchen. I placed my hand on the folded paper and held it tight, the edges cutting lightly into my skin. Something inside me whispered that this was not the end. This was the beginning. The kettle clicked on, and as I waited for the water to boil, I stared out the window at the quiet street. The world outside was waking, but I felt like I had been reborn into a truth I could no longer look away from. They had used me for years, and I had let them. That night was the last time I would. The sun crept higher, spilling pale light across the kitchen counter, where the booking paper still lay folded. My eyes felt gritty from lack of sleep, and yet my body refused to rest. I reached for the phone on the wall, my fingers hovering for a moment before flipping open the small address book I had not touched in years. Pages filled with fading numbers, some belonging to people long gone, some to people I had not spoken to in decades. One name stopped me cold. Evelyn Moore. I traced the letters with my finger, remembering her laugh, her wild red hair that she refused to tame, her stubborn insistence that life should be an adventure. We had met in college, both studying education, both dreaming of teaching children and someday retiring by the ocean. Life had carried her to Oregon with her husband, while I stayed in Illinois raising Daniel and building a life with Hugh. We sent cards for a while, then calls became rare, and eventually silence slipped in. My hand shook as I dialed the number. It rang 3 times before a familiar voice, older but still warm, answered. "Hello, Evelyn," I whispered. "It's me, Lorna." There was a pause, then a sudden rush of joy. "Lorna Hayes. Oh, my lord, is it really you?" Her laughter bubbled through the line, and for the first time in days, I felt a small smile tug at my lips. We exchanged a flurry of words overlapping, clumsy, both of us trying to fit decades into a few sentences. Finally, she grew serious. "What's wrong, Lorna? You sound tired." The tears welled again, though my voice stayed steady. "I am tired. Tired of being used. Tired of being invisible." Evelyn didn't hesitate. "Where are you right now? I'm coming to see you." "No," I began. "You don't have to." "Too late. I'm already in my car. Springfield isn't that far from me." "Don't argue." The line clicked dead before I could answer. I stood frozen, staring at the receiver in my hand, stunned by her certainty. Hours later, a knock at the door jolted me. When I opened it there, she stood a little shorter. Her hair streaked silver, but still Evelyn, still the same energy radiating from her eyes. She pulled me into her arms without a word, holding me so tightly that the dam I had tried to build crumbled. I sobbed against her shoulder the way I hadn't allowed myself to cry in front of Daniel or anyone else. She guided me inside, settled me on the couch, and took both my hands in hers. "Start at the beginning," she said softly. I told her everything. About the Sunday dinners that had become obligations. About Marcia's sharp words, Daniel's indifference, Ethan's distance, Lily's quiet guilt. About the trip, the lie about the van, the paper with Vanessa's name. As I spoke, Evelyn's face shifted from shock to fury. Her lips pressed thin as she shook her head. By the time I finished, her grip on my hands was firm. "Lorna," she said, her voice steady and clear, "if they replaced you with a stranger, then it's time for you to choose your own life again." Her words struck deep like a bell ringing in my chest. I sat back staring at her. My breath caught. She smiled, then softer. "Do you remember our plan back in college to buy little cottages by the sea paint when we wanted to teach kids in the afternoons? We used to dream of watching the waves every evening, drinking tea on the porch." I laughed through my tears, the memory rushing back. "We even picked out the town on the map. Sunset Bay." Evelyn's eyes lit up. "That's where I live now." Sunset Bay, Oregon. After the divorce, I decided I was done living for everyone else. I bought a small house near the water. You should see it, Lorna. The sunsets are just as beautiful as we imagined." Her voice carried the sea with it, the possibility of air that smelled like salt instead of regret. I pictured it for a moment, the waves rolling in the horizon, wide and endless, and something in me ached for it. "But I can't just leave," I said faintly. "This is my home." "Is it?" she asked gently. "Or is it just the place where you've been stuck?" The words sank into the silence. I looked around the living room, the walls lined with old photographs, the same furniture Hugh had chosen decades ago, the heavy air of memories that felt more like chains than comfort. "I don't even know where I'd start," I whispered. "With yourself," Evelyn replied. "You start with yourself." We sat together for hours, reminiscing, filling in the lost years, laughing at old stories of sneaking out of dorms and whispering dreams under blankets. For the first time in so long, I felt seen. Not as Daniel's mother, not as Ethan and Lily's grandmother, not as Marcia's convenient helper. Just me, Lorna. The afternoon light faded, spilling gold across the floor, and Evelyn stood stretching her back. She turned to me, her eyes shining. "Come visit me in Sunset Bay, just for a weekend. No obligations, no strings. See it for yourself." I hesitated, chewing my lip. She stepped closer, pressing my hand with that fierce certainty she had always carried. "Life is short, Lorna. Too short to wait for scraps of love from people who don't see your worth." Her words lingered in the air even after she left that evening, promising to call me the next day. I walked her to the door, hugged her tightly, and stood on the porch as she drove away, her taillights glowing against the dusk. When I stepped back inside, the house seemed emptier than ever, but for the first time, the emptiness didn't just feel like loss. It felt like possibility. I closed the door, leaned against it, and whispered to myself what Evelyn had said. If they replaced you with a stranger, then it's time to choose your own life. The sentence echoed inside me long after the house grew dark. A few days later, Daniel called and asked if I could stop by the house while they were packing for their trip. He needed me to water the plants, collect the mail, make sure nothing piled up while they were away. His voice was brisk, as if he were assigning a task to an assistant, not asking a favor from his mother. I agreed quietly, even though a weight settled in my chest as I hung up the phone. Their neighborhood was newer than mine, rows of tidy homes with trimmed lawns and wide driveways. When I unlocked the door with the spare key they had given me years ago, the scent of fresh paint and cleaning supplies greeted me. The house was spotless, Marcia's style stamped on every detail, polished and cold. I moved through the rooms, watering the plants, collecting a small pile of envelopes from the mailbox, arranging them neatly on the counter. My steps slowed when I reached the living room. A folder lay open on the coffee table, its edges crisp, a pen resting beside it. I bent down, meaning only to straighten the pile and set it aside, but the bold heading on the top sheet caught my eye. Inheritance loan agreement. My heart thudded as I sank onto the couch and pulled the folder closer. The words blurred at first, my hands trembling, but slowly the meaning sharpened. Daniel's name was typed neatly on the first page as borrower. The lender was not a bank I recognized, but a private finance group, one with an address I had never heard of. I turned the page and felt my breath leave me. There it was, a copy of my old will, the one I had written after Hugh died, leaving the house to Daniel. The house I was sitting in was not mentioned, of course, but my own home, the one Hugh and I had built our life in, was printed clearly under collateral for future inheritance. The words pierced like knives. He had taken out a loan secured by my death. He had handed strangers a promise of my house, a house that still held my clothes in the closet, my photos on the walls, my memories pressed into every board. I pressed my hand over my mouth, my stomach twisting. Page after page outlined repayment schedules, penalties, interest rates. It was a large sum, far more than I had imagined my son ever borrowing, and all of it rested on the assumption that one day soon I would no longer be alive and he would claim what was left. I couldn't stop staring at my own name printed there, reduced to a line in a financial document. Not a mother, not a woman, not a person with a beating heart. Just collateral. A sound escaped me, half sob, half gasp. The folder slid from my lap onto the carpet papers scattering across the floor. I pressed both hands to my face and tried to breathe, but my chest tightened as though the air itself had turned against me. Images of Daniel as a boy flashed across my mind. His small hand clutching mine on his first day of school, his laughter echoing in the yard as Hugh pushed him higher on the swing, his tears the night he scraped his knee and crawled into my lap for comfort. All those moments, all the love I had poured into him, all the years of sacrifice now reduced to numbers on a page, an asset to be leveraged. I bent down, gathering the papers with shaking fingers, and slid them back into the folder. My reflection stared back at me from the glass of a framed photo on the table, Hugh and I holding baby Daniel, both of us smiling with pride. I could hardly recognize the woman in the glass now. The house was silent, but the sound in my head was deafening. Every word Evelyn had said echoed again. If they replaced you with a stranger, then it is time for you to choose your own life. I thought I had already felt the deepest betrayal, but this was worse. This was not being forgotten, not being replaced on a trip. This was being stripped of humanity altogether, reduced to property, a transaction waiting to be claimed. I sat frozen for a long time, the folder clutched in my lap. The ticking of the clock on the wall marked each second, and with each tick I felt the truth sink deeper. My son, my own flesh and blood, had gambled my home and my future away as though I were already gone. Finally, I placed the folder exactly where I had found it, and forced myself to walk toward the door. My legs felt heavy, my throat raw from holding back tears. When I stepped outside, the sky was darkening, the air cool against my damp cheeks. I locked the door carefully, slid the key back under the mat where Daniel had told me to leave it, and walked slowly to my car. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly they ached, but I did not start the engine right away. I sat there staring at the neat rows of houses, the tidy lawns, the glow of porch lights, and felt myself crumble inside. I was not a mother in their eyes anymore. I was collateral, a number on a page, a house to be inherited. The night pressed in around me, and I lowered my forehead to the wheel. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just grieving, I was beginning to change. The next morning, I woke with a heaviness that no amount of tea or prayer could shake. The folder I had seen at Daniel's house haunted me, each page branded into my mind. I knew I could not ignore it. By noon, I found myself walking into a small office downtown, its brass plaque reading Preston and Associates. Inside smelled faintly of leather and old paper. A secretary with tidy hair asked my name, then ushered me into a room lined with bookshelves. Behind a large oak desk sat Mr. Preston, a man in his mid-50s with kind but sharp eyes. He rose to shake my hand, firm and respectful, and gestured to the chair opposite him. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his tone gentle. "I understand you'd like to discuss an urgent matter." I smoothed my skirt and handed him the notes I had scribbled from memory. I did not take the folder, I said quickly, but I saw enough. My son signed a loan against my house, against a will I wrote years ago. I don't know how it is even possible. He adjusted his glasses and read silently for a few moments. Then he leaned back, fingers steepled. "Unfortunately, this sort of arrangement, while morally questionable, is not illegal. Some private lenders will issue loans using future inheritances as collateral if they see strong likelihood of repayment." I stared at him. "So he has tied my life, my death, to a contract." Preston did not flinch. "Essentially, yes. But here is the important part. The will you originally drafted gave him rights to the house. That document is what he likely used. However, as the living owner, you retain full authority. You can alter your will, you can sell the property, you can transfer ownership." A spark flickered in me, though fear crowded in too. "If I sell, what happens to him?" His voice was calm, precise. "If you sell, the lender loses their collateral. The loan would be called in immediately. Your son would be forced either to repay it or face severe financial consequences." I looked down at my lap, my hands twisting together. It felt both like poison and medicine at once. He had gambled with my life, with my home, and if I acted, he would feel the weight of it. Preston leaned forward. "I do not give advice on family relationships, but I can tell you this. You have every right to act in your own best interest. For too long you have allowed others to dictate how you live." His words echoed Evelyn's, only sharpened by legality. My voice trembled. "He is my only son. I never thought he would see me as anything other than his mother." Mr. Preston's eyes softened. "Family can wound us in ways strangers never could. But the law is clear. This is your decision, and yours alone." Silence stretched between us, filled only by the quiet ticking of a wall clock. Finally, I lifted my chin, my spine straightening. If they replaced me on a family trip, if my son replaced my life with a number on a loan, then maybe it is time I replaced the future he thinks he owns. "Mr." Preston nodded. "Then let us begin with updating your will. We can ensure your grandchildren are provided for directly rather than through your son. We can also begin preparing documents should you choose to sell your home." I exhaled slowly, the decision settling in my bones like steel. "Please proceed." For the next hour, he explained options, investment choices, clauses to protect Ethan and Lily until they were of age. He wrote down terms in plain language, careful and deliberate. I listened numb and alive at the same time. Each line I agreed to was another stitch in a new fabric, one not woven of submission, but of choice. When I left the office, the late afternoon sun struck my face. The air felt clearer than it had in months, maybe years. I paused on the sidewalk, clutching my purse, and whispered to myself, "If they can replace me, I can change everything." The words did not sound bitter. They sounded like truth. I walked to my car with a steadier step than I had when I entered. The path ahead was frightening, but for the first time in a long time, it was mine. 2 days later, I sat across from Mr. Lambert in a small office with wide windows that overlooked downtown Springfield. He was a man in his late 50s with graying hair and a measured voice that carried both reassurance and gravity. His desk was covered in neat stacks of folders, and one of them now lay open in front of me. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, tapping the top sheet with a pen. "I think I have the perfect buyers for your home. The Brooks family." He leaned back slightly. "Dr. Brooks has just accepted a position at Memorial Hospital here in Springfield, and his wife is a registered nurse. They need a house quickly, preferably within the week." My heart jolted. Within the week? I had thought this process might take months, perhaps longer. The speed frightened me, but also tempted me. Lambert studied me carefully. "They're prepared to pay $480,000 in cash. No contingencies, no delays. A clean transaction." I tried to focus on the numbers on the practical side. The figure was higher than I had expected, enough to give me freedom, enough to secure a small house near Evelyn and still leave plenty for the future. Yet the thought of leaving these walls, the place Hugh and I had filled with 40 years of memories, made my throat tighten. Lambert slid the papers closer. "I want to be clear with you," he said. "This is not a small decision. Once you sign, there is no turning back. The Brooks family will take possession as soon as the funds clear." I looked past him to the window. The late afternoon sun poured across the rooftops of Springfield, casting long shadows. I thought of Ethan running down the hallway as a little boy, his hands smudged with chocolate. I thought of Lily sitting at my kitchen table coloring while I baked pies. I thought of Hugh's laughter echoing in the backyard during summer barbecues. Every corner of this house held a piece of my life. My hand trembled as I reached for the pen. Lambert waited in silence, respectful but firm. He was right. Once I put my name down, there would be no road back. I swallowed hard and forced myself to breathe. Daniel had turned me into a number on a loan agreement. Marcia had replaced me with her cousin for a trip that should have been family. My place here had already been stolen in their minds. This house was no longer my refuge. It was my prison holding me in a role I no longer accepted. The pen felt heavy as I lowered it to the page. For a moment I hesitated, staring at the blank line meant for my signature. My hand shook so badly I thought I might drop it. But then I heard Evelyn's voice in my memory, steady and insistent. "If they replaced you, then choose your own life." I pressed the tip to paper and signed my name. The sound of the pen scratching across the page echoed louder than it should have. My heart pounded in my ears, and when I lifted my hand, I realized my palm was damp with sweat. Lambert gave a single nod, then took the folder back and stacked it neatly. "Congratulations, Mrs. Hayes. The Brooks family will be thrilled. I will handle the rest. The funds should be transferred within a week." I sat back in the chair, my chest rising and falling rapidly. I had done it. In a few strokes of ink, I had unraveled decades of history. The walls that had seen my first years of marriage, my son's childhood, Hugh's last days, no longer belonged to me. Lambert closed the folder and looked at me with measured kindness. "I know this isn't easy. I have seen many families go through it, but I promise you this is a step forward, not backward." I nodded mutely. My throat felt too tight for words. When I finally left the office, the sky had turned dusky, streaked with pink and violet. The cool air hit my face and I drew in a long breath. I walked slowly to my car, my knees unsteady as though the ground itself had shifted. Sitting in the driver's seat, I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes were red, my cheeks pale, but behind the exhaustion was something else. Determination. I gripped the steering wheel, let out a shaky laugh, and whispered into the empty car. "It's done." My pulse still raced as I started the engine. For the first time in years, I felt like I had set something in motion that could not be undone. While I sat in Springfield with the ink still drying on those papers, my son and his family were hundreds of miles away in California, smiling for photographs under a castle built of lights. I pictured Daniel walking down Main Street in Disneyland, Lily tugging at his hand, Ethan drifting behind with his eyes glued to his phone. Marcia no doubt marched at the front, her cousin Vanessa close by acting as if she had always belonged. That was the moment Daniel's phone buzzed. I was not there, but I could imagine his face as he glanced at the screen, expecting perhaps a client or a colleague. Instead, it was the bank. He stepped aside near a popcorn cart, lifted the phone to his ear, and listened. Within seconds, the color drained from his face. "Mr. Hayes," the voice on the other end said firmly, "your loan has been called. The property listed as collateral has been sold. We require immediate repayment or alternative security." I imagined his breath catching. "Sold." He must have stammered, his voice rising, while families bustled around him, their laughter and music clashing with his dread. "That property belongs to my mother." "It no longer does," came the reply. "The sale was finalized this week. You will need to arrange repayment at once." Marcia spotted him from a distance, her eyes narrowing at his pale expression. She strode over Vanessa, trailing behind with a churro in hand. "What is it?" she demanded, tugging at his sleeve. Daniel hung up slowly, his hand shaking. His words came haltingly. "The bank. They want the money. The house. It's gone." Marcia blinked, stunned, then her voice sharpened like glass. "Gone. What do you mean, gone?" He swallowed. "Mom sold it." Her voice shot up so high that people turned their heads. "You never told me you borrowed against her house." "Daniel, how could you?" Children nearby froze with their ice cream cones, their parents pulling them away as the argument grew. Ethan and Lily, who had been waiting near a souvenir stand, drifted back wide-eyed. Ethan's phone slipped into his pocket, his face suddenly alert. Marcia pressed on her cheeks, flaming. We are on vacation, Daniel, with the kids with my cousin, and you drop this on me. You put our home at risk without saying a word. Daniel tried to hush her, his hands out in a futile gesture. Please, not here. But Marcia's fury could not be contained. Her voice carried across the crowded walkway. Not here. When the bank is calling for repayment. When we could lose everything. Not here. Ethan tugged at his father's sleeve, his voice uncertain. Dad, what's happening? Daniel looked down, but his lips barely moved. Nothing you need to worry about. Marcia spun toward him. Nothing. Do you think our children are blind? They just heard the bank is after us. Lily's eyes filled with tears as she whispered to her brother. Why didn't Grandma come with us? That tiny voice pierced the chaos like a bell. Marcia heard it. Daniel heard it even. Vanessa paused mid-bite. For one fragile moment, silence fell. Then Marcia exploded again, this time with a mixture of rage and despair. You have ruined us, Daniel! You have destroyed this family with your secrets! He barked back, his own temper unleashed. Don't blame me. If your cousin hadn't been added, maybe Mom would not have felt cast aside. The words hung in the air like thunder. Vanessa stepped back. Her cheeks flushed, suddenly exposed in a fight she had not expected to be named in. Crowds parted around them, eyes flicking in curiosity, whispers chasing after. The Hayes family, once strolling with smiles, now stood in the heart of the happiest place on earth, tearing each other apart. Ethan lowered his gaze, ashamed. Lily clutched her brother's hand as if holding on against a storm. Their faces were not those of children on vacation, but of children watching their family collapse in public. Daniel tried to steady his voice, lowering it to a harsh whisper. We will fix this when we get back. I'll find another way. Marcia shot him a glare that could slice steel. If we even have a house to go back to? The tension lingered like smog over them, heavier than the California sun. Every step after that felt poisoned. What had been meant as a week of joy had turned into a battlefield. By nightfall, the fireworks above the castle burst in dazzling colors, but below my family stood fractured. For them, the music and lights were nothing more than a cruel disguise masking a nightmare that had only just begun. The house felt strangely hollow once the last of my boxes were packed. The walls that had echoed with family dinners and arguments now carried only the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old clock Hugh once wound every Sunday. I moved from room to room with a rag and a dustpan wiping surfaces that no longer belonged to me, almost like I was erasing my fingerprints from a life I had been pushed out of. On the kitchen table, I laid out a sheet of stationery, thick and cream-colored, the kind I saved for special notes. I smoothed it with both hands and sat for a long while, pen hovering as if the words might come from the ceiling beams or the floorboards themselves. When I finally began, the ink bled heavy and deliberate. Daniel, I wrote. By the time you read this, I will no longer be in Springfield. This house has been sold. I did not make this decision lightly, but it was one forced on me by the truth I could no longer ignore. I paused, staring at the words. The pen shook, but I pressed on. You may believe I was content being the quiet mother, the convenient grandmother, the one always available to babysit or lend money, the one who asked for nothing. But when Marcia told me that Vanessa would be going on your family trip in my place, it became painfully clear. I was not considered family anymore. I was an afterthought, an obstacle, someone to be replaced without hesitation. My chest ached, but I kept writing. And then I found the documents. The loan in my name secured by this very house, my own home used as collateral for your ambitions. I saw the copy of my old will, the one you must have presented to that lender as proof of what you expected to inherit. To discover that my life's work, my shelter, the place Hugh and I built together, had been reduced to a line item on a bank's ledger was the deepest wound of all. I stopped to breathe, my tears falling onto the page, smudging one word. I did not blot them away. Let him see, I thought. Let him see what this has done to me. You should know I am not leaving in bitterness but in clarity. You replaced me on vacation, but I replaced you in my will. That sentence sat on the page sharp as a blade. For once in my life, I had chosen the truth without apology. I explained my final choices with a steady hand. The funds from this house will sustain me as I begin anew. A portion will be directed to the elementary school where I taught for 30 years, so that children who once reminded me of you might have the supplies and guidance they need. The remainder, what would have once gone to you, will go directly to Ethan and Lily when they turn 21. They deserve a future unburdened by secrets and debts. I folded the letter slowly, slid it into an envelope, and wrote his name in bold script across the front. I placed it at the center of the kitchen table where he could not miss it. The rooms loomed empty as I walked through one final time. In the living room, I touched the mantel where Hugh's picture had stood. In the hallway, I ran my hand over the grooves carved when Daniel measured his height year by year. Upstairs, I lingered by the window where I once waited for headlights returning home. Every memory pressed against me, but instead of chaining me in place, they pushed me forward. I whispered a quiet goodbye to Hugh, to the past, to the woman who had bent herself until she nearly broke. By evening, only the essentials remained stacked by the door. The movers would handle the rest in the morning. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in the armchair one last time. The envelope rested a few feet away, stark and accusing, waiting for the son who had reduced me to an entry on a balance sheet. I sipped slowly, listening to the house breathe. The creaks, the sigh of the vents, the faint rattle of the pipes. All familiar, all soon to belong to someone else. When I drained the last of the cup, I rose, slipped on my coat, and picked up the small bag I would carry with me to Sunset Bay. I did not look back as I closed the door. The letter remained on the table, a truth waiting to be found, a truth that would fracture what was left of Daniel's illusions. The night air was cold as I stepped into it, but for the first time in years, it felt like air I could truly breathe. Evelyn pulled into my driveway at sunrise, her old blue Subaru humming like it had been waiting for this very day. We loaded the last of my boxes, the smaller ones I had insisted on handling myself, into the back seat. My rocking chair, Hugh's chair, had been carefully wrapped and strapped in a small trailer behind us. I watched the movers close the door of the empty house one final time, the lock clicking into place, and for a moment I wondered if I might collapse right there on the porch. Evelyn reached for my arm, steadying me, and whispered that it was time. We left Springfield with the sky streaked in pink and gold. The highway stretched ahead, fields rolling into forests, forests giving way to hills. The further we drove, the lighter my chest became, as if each mile peeled off another layer of weight I had carried for too long. Evelyn kept up a gentle stream of conversation, talking about her garden in Sunset Bay, the art classes at the community center, the coffee shop where locals lingered for hours. I listened, nodding, trying to absorb the promise of a life that might finally belong to me. By the time we crossed into Oregon, the air had shifted. It smelled saltier, cooler, touched with something wild and untamed. I rolled down the window and let the wind whip at my hair. When the first glimpse of ocean appeared, stretching wide and endless, I gasped like a child seeing magic for the first time. Evelyn laughed and said she had been waiting to hear that sound. Sunset Bay revealed itself slowly, a cluster of houses with porches facing the water. small shops lined with painted signs, gulls circling overhead. We turned down a quiet street where colorful gardens spilled over picket fences. Evelyn pointed ahead, and there it was. My house. It was smaller than the one I had left behind, but brighter with white siding and pale blue shutters that looked like they had been kissed by the sea. A wooden porch wrapped around the front, and beyond it I could see the faint shimmer of waves. My knees trembled as I stepped out of the car. Evelyn handed me the keys, pressing them into my palm with a smile that held both pride and relief. Inside, the rooms were simple and filled with light. A wide living room opened onto a kitchen with cabinets painted soft cream. The bedrooms smelled faintly of new paint and cedar. Windows framed the ocean like living portraits. I walked through each space, touching the door frames, the smooth counters whispering to myself that this was real. The movers arrived later in the afternoon with the last of my belongings. I directed them where to set the boxes, and when they brought in Hugh's rocking chair, I stopped them at the porch. That was where it belonged, facing the ocean, ready to hold me through evenings of wind and waves. I ran my hand along the worn arms of the chair and felt the faint imprint of Hugh's hands, steady and strong. When the house was quiet again, I began unpacking. In the living room, I set out photo albums, arranging them on a shelf where sunlight touched them. I placed a porcelain figurine my mother had once given me on the mantel. In my bedroom, I unfolded quilts stitched decades ago, their colors still bright, and spread them across the bed. Slowly, the house began to feel less like a stranger's and more like mine. As twilight settled, Evelyn knocked on the door, carrying a basket of bread and fresh fruit. She insisted on helping me set the table for our first meal together in my new home. We ate simple food and laughed as if we had never lost touch all those years. She poured me a glass of wine and said she had always known I would find my way back to the dream we once shared. After she left, I wandered out to the porch. The air was cooler now, the scent of salt sharper. The horizon burned orange and purple as the sun slipped into the sea. I sat in Hugh's rocking chair, the wood creaking softly beneath me, and let the rhythm carry me. The ocean spread endlessly before me, waves rising and falling with a power that felt eternal. I drew a long breath, filling my lungs with the sharp, briny air. My chest expanded until it ached, and then I whispered into the dusk, "Hugh, I did it." My voice trembled, but the words floated into the air, as steady as the tide. For the first time since he had gone, I felt he was near, not as a ghost, but as a companion smiling with me at this new beginning. The waves answered with a crash against the rocks, and I closed my eyes, rocking gently, letting the sea sing me into a peace I had thought I would never know again. The knock on my door came on a gray morning when the fog rolled in from the sea and blurred the horizon. I opened it, and there stood Daniel, thinner than I had ever seen him. His shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world pressed on his back. His eyes were bloodshot, his shirt wrinkled, and the boyish spark I once knew had vanished. He didn't greet me with his usual hurried tone. He just said my name, Mom, like a plea, and I stepped aside, motioning him in. He paused at the doorway, taking in the little cottage, the photos on the shelf, Hugh's chair on the porch. His gaze lingered on the rocking chair, then drifted back to me. "You really did it," he whispered. "You left." I nodded, keeping my voice calm. "I told you in the letter." He sat down heavily at the small kitchen table, his hands trembling as he rubbed at his face. I poured him a glass of water and set it before him, but he didn't touch it. Instead, his voice cracked as he spoke. "We are drowning, Mom. The bank, they're threatening to take our house. Marcia is furious with me. The kids don't understand why everything is falling apart." He looked at me with desperation that pierced through my chest. I need your help. Please. I folded my arms and stood still, grounding myself in the steadiness of the floor beneath my feet. What kind of help are you asking for? Money, he admitted, his voice nearly breaking. If you could lend me enough to pay off part of the loan to give us breathing room, maybe we can save the house, the business. I swear I'll pay you back. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. Daniel, I said slowly, you took out that loan by using me as collateral without telling me, without asking for my permission. You treated my life, my home, as an asset you could gamble. He shook his head quickly. I never thought you'd find out, or that it would come to this. I thought I'd have time, that the business would take off. But it didn't, I replied. And now you want me to fix it. Tears welled in his eyes. You're my mother. I thought you'd understand. I felt my heart twist, but my resolve did not waver. I leaned across the table and looked directly at him. You replaced me with Vanessa on your vacation. You pushed me aside for a stranger because it was easier. That was your choice. And this, Daniel, this is the price of your choices. He flinched, his breath catching. I didn't mean to replace you. Marcia said it was more convenient, and I didn't fight her. He lowered his face into his hands. I was wrong. God, I was so wrong. His shoulders shook, and then he did something I hadn't seen in years. He cried openly, like the little boy who once ran to me when he scraped his knee. Instinct tugged at me to reach out to soothe him, but I held myself still. He needed comfort, yes, but he also needed truth. Daniel lifted his head, eyes swollen. I'll lose everything. The house, the business, my family. Can't you do something? I walked to the window, watching the waves crash and retreat. For years I had lived for others, silencing my needs. Not anymore. I turned back to him. I will not undo what you created. I will not sacrifice this life I've built to patch over your mistakes. His lip quivered. So that's it. You're turning your back on me. I shook my head. I'm not turning my back on you. I'm finally facing forward for myself. Silence stretched between us. Then, with trembling steps, Daniel rose and crossed the room. He wrapped his arms around me awkwardly at first, then tightly, as if clinging to the last steady thing in his world. I felt his tears soak into my shoulder. I'm sorry, Mom, he whispered. For everything. I let my hand rest on his back for a brief moment, then gently pulled away. I forgive you, Daniel, but forgiveness is not the same as rescuing you. He nodded slowly, wiping at his face. His eyes carried both grief and a flicker of recognition, as if for the first time he saw me, not as a resource, but as a person with boundaries he could not cross. Neither of us spoke as he opened the door. The fog swallowed him as he walked down the path, his figure fading into the gray. I closed the door softly and leaned against it, my breath unsteady but my heart steady, knowing the line had been drawn and I would not cross it again. The morning after Daniel left the cottage was quiet, except for the sound of gulls crying outside and the crash of waves beyond the dunes. I stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing my coffee cup, staring out the window at the sea, and felt a calm I had not known in years. My son's tears, his pleading voice still echoed in my ears, but underneath the ache there was relief. I had chosen myself. For the first time in decades, I was no longer bound by guilt or obligation. The days unfolded gently in Sunset Bay. I learned the rhythm of the town, how the bakery filled with chatter at sunrise, how the fishermen's boats appeared on the horizon at dusk, their nets glinting in the last light. I began to walk the beach every morning with Evelyn. We picked up shells and driftwood, sometimes talking, sometimes quiet, always at ease in the kind of friendship that required no performance. One morning, she pressed a paintbrush into my hand and told me the community center was short one student in their art class. At first, I laughed. My hands trembled too much, I told her. But she persisted, and the following Tuesday I found myself sitting before a blank canvas. The first strokes were clumsy, but then the blue of the sky and the gray-green of the waves began to take shape. The paint loosened something in me. My grief, my anger, my memories of Hugh, all of it spilled into color. By the end of class, I was smiling without realizing it, a streak of cerulean paint on my wrist. The instructor asked me to come back, and I did. It wasn't long before I was volunteering again, too. Mark, the director of the Sunset Bay Maritime Museum, stopped me one afternoon after a class. He said he had heard I was a retired teacher and asked if I would help with school tours. I hesitated, but the next week I stood before a group of fourth graders explaining the tools sailors once used to navigate, pointing out the model of an old whaling ship. Their questions came rapid and curious, their laughter filling the small building, and I felt a surge of warmth I hadn't felt since leaving my classroom years ago. When they left, one little girl hugged me and said she wanted to be a teacher someday too. My eyes stung as I locked the doors that night. My home began to look like mine as well. I unpacked every photograph, placing them carefully on shelves and tables. The rocking chair stayed on the porch, its wood warmed by the sun, but I added a blanket across its back in the pattern Hugh had always loved. In the evenings, I lit a small lamp and opened my old albums. Sometimes I cried, sometimes I smiled, but always I felt safe in the walls that no one could take from me. Then, one late afternoon, a letter arrived. The envelope was addressed in careful, uneven handwriting. My heart caught when I saw the name in the corner, Lily. I sat at the table, my hands trembling as I unfolded the paper. "Dear Grandma," it began, "I miss you so much. Things are hard at home, and Dad and Mom fight a lot. Ethan pretends not to hear, but I know he does. I just wanted to say thank you for always being there for me. I still remember when you taught me how to bake cookies and when you read to me before bed. I hope one day I can come visit you. Please don't forget me. Love, Lily." I pressed the letter to my chest, tears running freely. Out of the wreckage of what had been my family, a small, bright thread of love still reached me. I pinned the letter to the fridge with a seashell magnet where I could see it each morning. Each time I walked past it, I felt both grief and hope. The months passed and Sunset Bay embraced me. I joined neighbors for Sunday potlucks, trading recipes and laughter. A widow named Patricia brought me cuttings from her rose garden, and they rooted in my yard. Thomas, a retired postman, showed me the best trails along the cliffs. Evelyn and I began painting together on the porch, our canvases catching the colors of sunset. Slowly, the ache in my chest lessened, replaced by a steady warmth. One evening, as autumn painted the trees crimson and gold, I sat on the porch watching the waves roll in. I thought of Daniel's, of the look on his face when he realized I would not rescue him. I thought of Marcia, so sharp and sure of herself, and wondered if she had softened at all in the face of consequence. I thought of Ethan, his eyes downcast, and Lily brave enough to write me a letter. For the first time, I did not feel anger. I felt distance, like watching a storm on the horizon. It no longer threatened me. The tide rushed forward and pulled back again, steady as breath. I leaned back in Hugh's chair, the wood creaking beneath me, and whispered into the dusk. They thought they could replace me. They thought I would always be there, silent and convenient. But I found myself again. I am not gone. I am alive. The stars blinked to life above the water, and I let the rocking of the chair soothe me. A chapter had ended, and another had begun, not written by anyone else but me. They thought they could replace me easily. They thought I was nothing but a seat on a van, a house to inherit, a wallet to borrow from. But I have found something stronger. I have found my voice, my peace, my freedom. For the first time in so many years, I am living for me. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched your heart, share your thoughts below. Have you ever been cast aside and found your way back to yourself? I would love to hear. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you can join me for more stories of family betrayal and the strength to begin again.